Good evening and welcome to a very special interview show of the Prode. Today we are eager to delve into a critical topic, Russia's illegal war on Ukraine and its profound repercussions on Europe, the US and the Western world. This conflict has not only triggered a humanitarian crisis but has also reshaped global security dynamics and economic stability. We will explore how this aggression challenges established international norms and what it means for the future of global alliances and strategic priorities. To discuss this critical issue, we are honored to have Masa Ocvirk with us, the program coordinator for Global Europe program at Wilson Center. Masa, originally from Slovenia, has a distinguished background that includes serving as the representative of the Slovenian National Assembly to the European Parliament in Brussels, where she played a key role during Slovenia's presidency of the Council of the EU in 2021. Her expertise spans EU common foreign and security policy, EU enlargement, and transactional relationships. She is a renowned geopolitical and European affairs analyst. Thank you so much, Masa, for your time and a very warm welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here.
So I would like to begin the discussion by asking that, how has Russia's invasion of Ukraine reshaped Europe's geopolitical landscape, especially regarding the security dynamics and geopolitical alliances?
Yes, so the Russian invasion of Ukraine effectively brought war back to Europe, which many thought would not happen again. And from one perspective, this brought back into the limelight, I would say, first NATO's role as a defensive alliance that provides collective security on the European continent, but also more broadly in the transatlantic context. And it also saw member states or member countries of the NATO alliance starting to significantly invest more in their defense. And furthermore, we saw two new European countries joining the alliance, which were Sweden and Finland. Furthermore, I would say what was the result was Europe reimagining itself more as a credible security and defense actor. While there have been initiatives on the EU level in terms of increased defense cooperation, this has deepened talks about building a European defense industry that can ensure defense readiness when it comes to the European continent. And yes, since then, we have seen a lot more conversation on how Europe can do more for its own defense. Another thing that I see as a prominent development has been the revival of, I would say, the European Atlantic integration. I already mentioned Sweden and Finland joining NATO, both before having centuries of policies of neutrality. And we also saw Ukraine's future in NATO being reaffirmed at the last NATO summit. Furthermore, there was also the EU's geopolitical awakening, let's put it like that, especially when it comes to its own enlargement. Ukraine, Moldova, and later on Georgia, both, they all applied for EU membership. And since then, Ukraine and Moldova have made significant progress on their path to EU membership. Unfortunately, due to domestic developments, Georgia has stalled in that regards. And then last but not least, there was also, in terms of EU enlargement, a new momentum for the Western Balkans, a region that has been heavily influenced by Russian disinformation, and therefore the EU has started paying more attention to be able to also bring that region closer to the EU.
Yeah, so you talked about the security dynamics. Now coming to the economic repercussions. So, what are the economic repercussions of the war for the EU, and how have sanctions on Russia, impacted Europe and the global markets?
Yeah, so after February 24th, 2022, the EU acted swiftly, not only by condemning Russia's full-fledged invasion, but also adopted sanctions packages in close cooperation with like-minded countries and partners with the aim of weakening Russia's economic base. Since then, the EU has adopted 14 such packages. And of course, this has repercussions both for Russia, but also for the European Union, because we had very intense trade relations with Russia beforehand. And the result is, of course, that trade has now at historically low levels. And by estimates, some around 1,000 companies, not just EU, but also in general, Western companies have left Russia or decreased their operations there. And I think another significant effect was EU experiencing a severe energy and cost of life crisis in 2022, which exposed, of course, and we can talk about that later, EU's heavily dependence on Russian energy exports. I would say that for the EU, this was an important sobering moment when it came to imposing sanctions on Russia, because it also realized its dependence on not only energy, but also on critical raw materials and the potential disruption in supply chains, for which the EU has now, of course, taken some steps to increase its strategic sovereignty. Or strategic autonomy, better said, in that regard. Furthermore, I think another big effect that happened was the disruption in the global food supply chains. This is more in direct regards to Ukraine. Ukraine is considered a Europe breadbasket, and most of its wheat exports actually go to Asia and Africa. With the start of the war in Ukraine, Russia effectively blocked exporting or blocked ports, Ukrainian ports to export. While there was a temporary solution with the Black Sea Grain Initiative deal, Russia has effectively withdrawn from it last year. And from then on, we saw another increase in higher food prices globally, and also continued rising in energy prices.
So, you talked about energy security. So, how has the conflict influenced Europe's approach to energy security, particularly in light of the previous reliance on the Russian energy?
Yeah, so as I've already mentioned, the war in Ukraine really exposed Europe's heavy reliance on Russian energy. Before the war, around 25% of EU's gross available energy came from Russia, including 40% of all of its natural gas imports. So you can imagine those are very large numbers. While we did see already before the start of the war, Russia weaponizing this energy dependency with some sporadic gas cutoffs, the war really exacerbated this, and it resulted in an energy crisis in Europe. The prices in energy spiked enormously in 2022. But I would say that lessons learned from the EU dealing with the COVID crisis really also helped member states find and adopt some joint efforts and mechanisms to mitigate the effects of decoupling from Russian energy. So in short term, we saw increased efforts to diversify energy suppliers. Here, there was new deals with the US and Norway in terms of supplying LNG. We also saw measures for member states to fill up their gas reserves before winter, and that was a joint effort, and also to cut energy demand in general. And another thing that was very prominent was to put in place a mechanism to prevent further price spikes like the ones that happened in 2022, to protect citizens and businesses. So this, I would say, was more on a short term. On a longer term, of course, the EU has doubled down on its green transition to make Europe climate neutral by 2050. However, one needs to emphasize that while this has been kind of a beacon of the current and the future president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, the green transition now has become kind of a point of contention. Especially, we saw that during the last European parliamentary elections. We've seen, farmers' protests across Europe, and we saw far-right parties appropriating these fears of renewed rising energy costs to effectively discredit EU climate legislation. So we now see, with this new European Commission term approaching, we have now seen calls for a more pragmatic approach to green transition that goes more in line to the need to build EU competitiveness. So it therefore remains to be seen how all of this will affect EU's future climate ambitions. But yeah.
Yeah, so we talked about the economic aspect as well as the defense aspect. Now coming to the geopolitical relations and diplomatic relations between the countries. So in what ways has the war affected EU-US relations, and has it enhanced transatlantic cooperation or highlighted tensions?
Yeah, so I think at the start of the war, we saw great transatlantic unity in terms of supporting Ukraine. Some even say the war reinvigorated the transatlantic relationship. From day one, there was good cooperation between the US and the EU, both in terms of providing financial, diplomatic, and military assistance to Ukraine, as well as sanctions coordination. Since then, both sides, I would say, have continued working together on expanding sanctions, detecting sanctions evasions, humanitarian recovery aid to Ukraine, and most recently, we also are following now the developments in terms of a deal on how to use profits generated by Russian frozen assets to support Ukraine. That would involve both support from the US and the EU. So I would say, more than transatlantic disunity, the question of continued support for Ukraine has exposed internal political polarization that's present on both sides, and in the EU and in the US. And this is something that Russia has been capitalizing on through use of propaganda, disinformation, and other hybrid activities to further sow distrust in democratic institutions and governance, and essentially try to weaken both the EU and the US within, which would then ultimately also affect their capabilities to act on the world stage. But one thing I would see as a potential future concern would be the role of China. And since China has been increasingly involved in enabling Russia to continue waging war in Ukraine, this is one area where I do see difficulties in terms of reaching a unified approach between the US and the EU, because while both do perceive or do agree on the need to de-risk from China, I think their threat perception and how to deal with that is still very different. And we will see how this will continue developing. However, I would say that in general, when it comes to the transatlantic approach to global security and foreign policy, the main focus from both sides still remains to safeguard the current international rules-based order.
Yeah, so you talked about the role of China. How do you assess the role of other impactful nations like India in this whole conflict?
Yes, I think India should also be considered a very important actor, and I think both the EU and the US recognize its role. I think also recent visit of Modi in Ukraine showed that India is determined to play an ongoing important role in the current international system, in the current geopolitical situation. So while I do sometimes see that both actors are kind of trying to find an effective strategy to deal with India or to have a more productive relationship or cooperation. I think in terms of looking at the Quad, the US really recognizes the role of India. The EU, from my and this is my personal view, still has a bit more work to do to recognize what all could be areas of effective cooperation in terms of that. But it is important to engage all these nations because, you know, the rules of international law, safeguarding those rules, safeguarding the right to self-determination is in interest of everyone, not just the West.
Yeah. So, now coming to the EU's military posture. So, are we seeing a shift in the European Union's military posture and defense spending due to the conflict, or there is still a heavy reliance on NATO for the same?
So I think in general there has been a concrete shift in, let's call it first, Europe's defense posture. As I've said it already before, countries have significantly increased their defense spending, with most of them today spending more than 2% of their GDP. Countries like Poland is spending even more. It's around 4%. Then you have Estonia, Latvia, and Greece that are above 3%. But I think years of underspending before that has resulted in the fact that currently member states are not able to meet the short-term demands of supporting Ukraine, as well as they have difficulties recapitalizing its own forces. And this is then, of course, promulgated discussions on what the EU's role could be in terms of boosting defense production, boosting defense industry. And while defense cooperation in the EU is not something completely new and is not something that has started only after the invasion of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, there were some joint initiatives already before, but they never really took off. That would be my assessment. And the invasion of Ukraine really is what promulgated these discussions of EU's role as a defense actor and the need to invest more jointly in these capabilities. So in the last year, we saw the European Commission proposing the European Defense Industrial Strategy to support the competitiveness and the readiness of the European defense industry. This is now still a proposal. We will see how much progress the current Hungarian presidency will be able to achieve to move these proposals further. The biggest question, of course, is where the money will come from, because building such an industry will require significant investment. So looking at all of that, I would not go as far as saying that we are going to see a completely independent EU defense. Yes, there have been calls for Europe to do more on its own. And I think all of this should be considered as positive attempts for Europe to do things more closely in matters of interoperability, innovation, joint procurement, which I think is very necessary to be defense ready. But I do not see EU developing itself independently of NATO. And I think the EU's role should be utilized in terms of what its strengths are, which is, generating investments, generating funds for such things for the defense industry, in line, of course, with what's been called, in line with the calls for a greater strategic autonomy. But I would say that in all of that, there needs to be insurance or cooperation needs to be ensured between the EU and NATO to have, I would say, the best results. Because in the end, 23 out of 27 EU members are also NATO members. So I would say in the future, I see more cooperation between EU and NATO, and not EU developing itself as a defense completely independently of NATO.
Yeah, so how has the NATO's role in Europe evolved in response to the aggression, and what are the implications of potential NATO expansion? As you mentioned that Europe is going to rely more on NATO compared to expanding their own military, infrastructure.
Yes. So I would like to first emphasize that NATO has been and remains a defensive alliance, and that it is Russia who decided to, violate international law by launching a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And it seems that the war continues on, and Russia continues with that to pose a significant and direct threat to the security of NATO members. The alliance is acting in accordance to that, to adapt to this new contested security order by strengthening its deterrence and defense capabilities. It's I want to emphasize, we at the Wilson Center in June, before the NATO summit, hosted the Secretary General, Jens Stoltenberg, and he put it very well, that the purpose of NATO is not to fight a war, but to prevent a war. And I think this summarizes very well NATO's current actions when it comes to the ongoing war with Ukraine. And I think this ties also very well with the question of potential NATO enlargement. I mean, Sweden and Finland both ended their centuries-old policies of neutrality in military affairs because of threats from Russia, and not the other way around. So when it comes to potential further NATO enlargement, the leaders at the NATO summit, of course, reaffirmed their commitment to an open door policy. This has always been a policy of NATO, and an open door policy means that membership is open to any European state that is willing to contribute to the alliance in terms of politically, but also in terms of defense. And since NATO's establishment, all countries have joined the alliance on the basis of a sovereign decision, and which was often also supported by public support through referendums. And Ukraine has expressed a wish to do so, to join the alliance, to adhere to these principles. And as a sovereign country, it has every right to do so.
Yeah, so I would like to conclude the discussion by asking that, looking ahead, what does the future hold for EU-Russia relations? Can diplomacy be restored, or has the war, altered this dynamics?
Yes, so I will have a pretty short and straightforward answer here. I think the ball is primarily in Russia's court when it comes to future relations with the West, future relations with the EU. It first needs to stop its full-scale invasion of Ukraine and show its commitment to a just and lasting peace. Everything else can and will follow from there. So what is important is the ongoing unity from the EU, the US, and other allies and partners on supporting Ukraine, because Ukraine is also fighting for our democratic values and for the survival of the international rule of law.
Thank you so much, Masa, for your time, and thank you for shedding the light on this important and critical issue that affects us all. Thank you very much for joining.
Of course, thank you for having me.
Thank you so much.